their accommodation, the difficulty people have in relation to their accommodation, and the fact that they're never going to have that permanent home that people can settle in and their kids can go to school and go through the system and so on. So we need a lot of support here, and that's basically what we're saying. What our motion here tonight is talking in terms of supporting people that are in the middle of this crisis. It's a genuine attempt. I don't think anyone should, engage in partisan stuff in relation to. If we're doing our job as political representatives, we should know that there's a crisis out there. Come on.
Go.
23.5% of those with domestic mortgages are in mortgage distress. Behind each of these numbers, we have families or individuals who invested in hope and now are living in despair. Most of these homes are negative equity, so people can't escape from them. They're trapped in homes that they can't afford. And the central bank says there needs to be more done. Fiona Muldoon has asked what are the banks are waiting for. The governor of the central bank has said if the banks don't deal with it, you, Minister, will have to put extra capital into the banks. And yet, under your watch, the problem has doubled in the last 2 years. The personal insolvency bill is not going to fix the problem because significantly, as Richie Boucher has said, there's going to be no write-downs. And while the citizens slide into debt, we have the typical Fine Gael Labour dysfunction, words but no actions. Now, it's Sinn Féin's policy that if you fix the real economy, you'll fix the debt problem. And Sinn Féin's policy talks about investing into the real economy and developing badly needed infrastructure that will create jobs now, but will also create competitiveness and efficiencies into the future. I don't know if you saw, but there was a recent study by the central bank which showed that if you invest €2 billion, it will have the effect of reducing unemployment by 0.5%. It would have the effect of stabilising the housing market and possibly increasing house prices by 2%. This, in turn, would actually lower projected losses on the bank's mortgages from 8 to 7.5%. Now, because of the decisions of the government of this dysfunction, the state is on the hook for the capital requirements of the banks. So a reduction in mortgage defaults would benefit the public finances. It's also Sinn Féin's policy that an independent statutory distressed mortgage resolution process needs to be legally binding, and it needs to work on a case-by-case basis. And this would actually protect the family through a variety of measures, most importantly, Minister, through write-downs, shared equity, and transferring tenure type to social renting. Now, even if there are people out there who are oblivious to the human suffering that's involved in here, and even if their political ideology is based on the size of their wallet, this policy would make a significant benefit to the economy. If you can take the risk out of the mortgage, if you can actually make a mortgage payable, a manageable mortgage, you will reduce the level of money that the state has to put into the banks. If we don't do that, we're going to continue recapitalisation of the banks. And also, the policy that the government is involved in has other economic side effects as well. It takes a significant section of the population out of this spending economy, which means that it will further depress an already collapsed domestic economy. Now, a functional government would actually direct the banks to deal with the issue in a proactive manner. It would introduce legislation that gives the central bank governor the power to ensure that banks pass on interest rate reductions from the ECB. It would ensure all budget-related decisions regarding mortgages are passed on immediately by the banks, and it would ensure that mortgage lenders and interbank commercial lenders share a proportion of the burden involved in the problem of mortgage distress. So critically here, we have the real economy still limping along because the government refuses to deal with this issue. And if the government fixed the real economy, it would have, in effect, a positive outcome on the debt crisis and also with regards to mortgage distress. So I implore the government to actually take on the considerations that Sinn Féin has made and support this motion.
Thank you, Deputy. I call now on Deputy Angus Snoddig. You have 3 minutes.
2 minutes?
Well, your colleague there saved 1, so you have 3.
2 minutes, and Deputy Shane lost 3 minutes.
3.
Gurmaga Tadima Urum, Leshan Lassu Tar Kurha Fuina Vride on Realtas, Akahara Hele, Tihir, Hoshilta, and Wilship Dowler and Gare came Tihir Ta, August Macwillinson, Fragra Ta, Osargor, Nish, Correlation, Fibre Ta, Gwing. On social housing, I laughed when I saw the government amendment, especially since it talked on a permanent new social housing, and then goes on to list how the state is going to further subsidise private landlords in this state with temporary leases. That's not a permanent solution, and it's not a solution at all, given that 42% of private rented accommodation doesn't even meet minimum standards at present. The realistic solution is providing direct funding to local authorities to build or purchase permanent social housing for nearly the 100,000 households on the housing list. As well as cutting the rent allowance, ROS or leasing bill, it would stimulate local economies, give a source of income to councils and regenerate the wastelands left by the last government, which allowed the collapse of regeneration projects in my own and in other areas of the city and the country. Coupled with this, there is a need for a constitutional change which would allow for a use it or lose it clause for derelict sites or derelict homes. The free transfer of empty apartments and houses to local authority held by NAMA would also help address the social housing needs of struggling Irish families a lot quicker and in a more permanent way than subsidising the landlords and speculators, many of whom caused many of our problems in the first place. In my own area, in Bluebell, there is an empty shell of an apartment block. In Inchicore nearby, there is the collapse of the St Michael's regeneration project, and a brand new large apartment block next door to that, also empty. A collapsed regeneration project in Cherry Orchard, several derelict sites which Dublin City Council earmarked in the constituency for senior citizen accommodation to replace the pokey bedsits many of them are in at present. Stalled large-scale regeneration projects in both St Teresa's Gardens and Dolphin House are also in the area. Investment in any of all of those projects would create jobs, stimulate the local economy and address dereliction, and most importantly provide homes for the homeless, overcrowded and those in inappropriate housed families.
Thank you very much. Deputy Shane Ross, you have 3.5 minutes actually.
Thank
Let
you.
you know when there's one to go.
Thank you, Ciarán, and I'd like to thank Deputy O'Snuddy for sharing time with me. The recognition of this problem, which was identified by the motion from Sinn Féin this evening, has been a long time coming. Indeed, it's staggering that this government has, as Deputy Turbine said, allowed this problem to double in size since it took office, sitting, fiddling, while the mortgage fire burnt. You know, it wasn't just Fiona Muldoon who warned about this several months ago. I think it was last November. But as recently as 2 weeks ago, the Governor of the Central Bank said he was tearing his hair out at the failure of the banks to tackle this problem. But by implication, he was also tearing his hair out at the failure of the government to tackle this problem, because the two of them in this are colluding in allowing the banks to put on their balance sheet, to keep on their balance sheet, indeed, values of houses which are unrealistic and thereby under-provisioning for bad debts. And we saw this before. We saw this before in the case of the developers. And this is only history repeating itself in another form, because the mortgage arrears problem is simply the second pillar of the Irish debt problem. The first one is being tackled in a fairly haphazard way, admittedly, but the second one has not really been tackled at all. And, you know, the reason why this is being tackled is not through any great political will or courage. It's because down the line this year, there are stress tests. And the stress tests coming in October are quite likely to come to the conclusion, because of the government's refusal to recognise the mortgage arrears problem, that the banks will once again need recapitalising. Now, if that happens, where is the money to come from? And we see no answer except for piecemeal answers, talk about split mortgages, the personal insolvency bill, which hasn't got the capacity to sort out a problem of this size. And that's why it's so important that we get a serious reply and seriously constructive suggestions for the government for tackling this problem, which is running out of hand, which is going to get worse. You know, when the property tax comes through people's letterboxes, in the end of March, May, and they have to pay them in July, people are going to begin to regard mortgages as an optional extra. And I know, and I predict this to members of the government now, they will look at their property tax bills and they will say, we can't pay that, but because you're confiscating it through the revenue commissioners, we'll take the other option. We won't pay our mortgages. The government is not facing up to this problem, and I think it must do so. It must do so immediately. And the result of its policy is going to be more recapitalisation, and where the money is going to come from will be an interesting question, which I would like to see answered this evening.
Thank you, Deputy. Call now Minister Jan O'Sullivan. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 2 remaining.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. And I do think it's been a very useful debate, and I thank Sinn Féin for raising these issues. But I do have to point out that what we're dealing with as a government is the consequences of the previous government's policies and belief systems, which were pro-cyclical, reckless lending and very poor regulation. And they were part of the belief system of the time, and that is what we're dealing with now. And unfortunately, the consequences have been very painful for a lot of our people. And we are now trying to deal with those issues sensitively, people who are experiencing severe mortgage arrears, and identifying innovative ways to meet social housing demand at a time when the public funds available to that end have never been scarcer. And I would love to have the kind of money to implement the various suggestions that came from Sinn Féin, but we do not have that money at the moment, and we have to deal with the problem as it faces us now. And I have to say that Deputy Ross is very good at describing the problem, but I haven't really heard too many solutions, Deputy Ross. We have introduced solutions, including the Personal Insolvency Act, and we are continuing to keep the pressure on the banks, and that whole area is very much at the top of the government's agenda. We have fundamentally redirected policy in relation to the area of housing, and this is the area I'm responsible for, in developing a sustainable housing policy, which is first and foremost recognising the mistakes that were made in the past. And our housing policy statement, published in June 2011, emphasises choice, equity across housing tenures and delivering quality outcomes for the resources invested. And equity across housing tenures includes the rental sector that Deputy O'Snoddick was talking about, and includes the various measures we've taken in that regard with regard to ensuring that the quality is better. The reality is that the financial parameters in which we will be operating for the coming years rule out a return to a very large capital-funded construction programme by local authorities, at least in the near future. As such, there is no single solution to increasing the level of social housing supply, and flexible and diverse approaches are required. These approaches include a continued focus on the social housing leasing initiative and other flexible funding models that deliver social housing solutions in the here and now. And while you may not like leasing, it does mean we can deliver in the here and now an awful lot more houses to people on housing lists than we could by any other method. And it doesn't mean it has to be the method forever, but for the moment it is a method that delivers. Further transfers of tenants from rent supplement to the rental accommodation scheme, and I think that's an important one. We're working with a range of public, private, voluntary and cooperative housing bodies on innovative approaches to provision of social housing, gaining a dividend for social housing where possible from vacant and unfinished properties and from the overhang in the property market, and obtaining a social dividend from NAMA. And I do accept that has been very slow, but it's certainly going to improve in terms of speed this year. The Government is also committed to developing other funding mechanisms that will increase the supply of permanent new social housing. Such mechanisms will include options to purchase, build to lease, the sourcing of loan finance by approved housing bodies for construction and acquisition. And I am open to any reasonable suggestions from that side of the House as well as this side. I have very little time, but I do want to also say that regeneration is not by any means dead. There are problems in some of the Dublin regeneration sites, but there certainly is regeneration going on in various parts of the country. I also just want to say briefly that I am working in relation to stimulus, and I want to refer to a targeted programme to improve the energy efficiency of existing local authority housing stock. And I think that could be a real win-win in terms of protecting the state's investment over decades and creating real employment activity and improving people's lives. And we're working on refurbishing and retrofitting works which are labour intensive and which will improve the social housing stock. In 2012, my department invested around €150 million in improving the existing social housing stock, with some €100 million invested in the physical and social regeneration of large estates and flat complexes in disadvantaged communities in 7 cities and towns around the country. We've spent around €52 million over 2 years on enhancing energy efficiency standards of local authority housing. But much more could be done, and I am engaging with my Cabinet colleagues to put together a package of measures to extend the benefits of energy retrofitting measures. In working to meet housing needs, I'd like to refer in particular to the accommodation needs of travellers, which is referred to in the motion, a section of our society which experiences particular problems, and as we've sadly witnessed in recent weeks, downright discrimination and racism in relation to social exclusion and disadvantage. And I want to emphasise the State's commitment in this area, which has been backed by a spend of over €190 million on traveller-specific accommodation since 2005. And we are continuing to protect funding in that regard. But you will appreciate also that, as well as the traveller-specific accommodation, the vast majority of travellers are also accommodated in standard social housing, which is funded by my department's local authority housing programme. But you know, there is, if you look at the annual count of traveller families, the 2011 annual count identified that only 3.4% of traveller families are now living in unauthorised sites in 2011, and it was a much larger figure in the recent past. So just to summarise, providing a sustainable framework for future housing policy is a priority for me as Minister. That won't be achieved by pie-in-the-sky economics or by ignoring the damage previous administrations inflicted. It will be achieved by working in partnership with many sectors to deliver homes for people, not profit for speculators. And I will work with deputies from all sides of this House to achieve that goal.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
I now call on Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 2 remaining.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. Well, Minister, can I say to you that the only people engaging in pie-in-the-sky economics are yourselves on the government benches? You see, because it could only be a really pie-in-the-sky formula that would leave families across the state struggling with mortgage distress, mortgage default, hobbling along on interest-only arrangements with the banks, and leave them in that limbo situation. You see, you've engaged really in your term of office in what can only be described as gesture politics, because you know that there's a big crisis in terms of mortgage debt. All of us know that. You know you have to do something, but you're not really prepared to grasp the nettle. So you introduce a personal insolvency framework that leaves a veto with the banks. What kind of craziness was that? You probably know, or at least I hope to goodness at this stage you know, that there is a requirement for write-down on these mortgages. Write-down is the only thing that will make them sustainable. But you're not prepared to say that out loud, to face that reality. And I have to say you're not alone, because Patrick Honohan, whether he's torn his hair out or not, is a matter for himself. But he too is not prepared to set targets for the financial institutions, to say very clearly to the banks that they have to deal with these distressed mortgages, and to map out an acceptable pace for those resolutions to take place. So your failure is the lack of an appropriate legislative framework to free people from the nightmare in which they find themselves in unsustainable mortgage debt. That's your failure. And the failure of the central bank and of Patrick Honohan is not to assert themselves with the banks and to say to them very clearly that it is not acceptable to us, the taxpayers, that the very banks that we have bankrolled, that we have recapitalised, would snub their noses at the citizens and taxpayers in this way. You talk about choice. That is your statement here this evening. There are people out there, families out there, with no choice. Those that cannot meet their mortgage repayments do not have choice. Those that go into default. And then, of course, those that find themselves on the housing waiting list. It is a source of scandal that there are over 100,000 applicants waiting to be housed by the local authorities in this state. That's much worse, you know, than even in the much earlier years of this state. And what's your answer for them? Your answer to them is just to hang on a little bit longer, or to go on to RAS, go into rented accommodation, much of which is so below par that it just is a joke. I know in my own constituency, I invite you to visit the private rented accommodation along the North Circular Road, for example. I invite you to visit the bedsits in which people live. I invite you to view the squalor in which citizens live in this republic in the year 2013. And then I ask you, Minister, to review your rhetoric as regards choice, because that's no kind of choice. In fact, that's a kind of misery. I think, looking at your record so far in government, it would be fair to say that you lack any coherent policy or approach in respect of homes and housing. The only single coherent measure that you brought forward is your property tax. So, not satisfied with the misery of mortgage holders and people in distress, not satisfied with the substandard condition of local authority housing in many cases, and certainly in the private sector, you think that the smart thing to do at this time is to tax the family home for those that can manage to keep a roof over their heads. That's not choice. That's not coherent. That is a government that is in denial, a government that is prepared to turn its face away from the needs of its citizens, and a government that will slavishly follow the instructions of the Troika and the views of your European partners, rather than facing up to and delivering the needs of citizens.
All right. Call now on Deputy Caoimhín O'Callaghan. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 2 remaining.
In the last and in previous Dáil, Minister, I made the point many times that government policy was market-driven rather than based on the right to housing and on meeting the social need for accommodation in Ireland. And we in Sinn Féin, as well as other progressive voices, including from among your own benches here in the past, were making those points long before the property bubble was allowed to inflate and inevitably to burst. If the demand for a real and effective state housing policy had been listened to, we could have avoided, I believe, the worst of the economic collapse. We would have seen the construction of quality and well-planned local authority housing on a wide scale. We would have seen control of house prices. We would have seen a more diverse economy, not over-reliant on the construction sector as presented. We would have seen affordable housing in the private sector and mortgages that did not burden people from the start of their working lives to the grave. All appeals for a sane and sensible and fair housing policy were ignored. Yes, you're absolutely right, ignored by a succession of 3 Fianna Fáil-led governments. The results are all around us today: economic collapse, a massive toxic bank debt, widespread mortgage distress, a dire shortage of local authority housing, and severe hardship for many tenants in the private rented sector. Your party leader, Minister, the present Tánaiste Eamon Gilmore, in his role as Labour Party leader in December 2008, put forward a comprehensive private members' motion here in the Dáil, similar in many respects to our Sinn Féin PMB here last evening and tonight. That 2008 Labour motion noted, and I quote from it, "The failure of the government to honour the commitment contained in the programme for government to expand delivery of social and affordable housing options to meet the needs of 90,000 households." Unquote. Now in 2013, 2 years after ye have come to office, what do we find? As our Sinn Féin motion states, this Fine Gael Labour government since 2011 has cut spending on housing by 19% to 585 million, leaving local authority housing desperately underfunded and resulting in 98,318 households on waiting lists for local authority housing in this state, a significant increase on the situation that applied only a few short years ago. To address this crisis, we are asking the government to develop a plan to commence the building of at least 5,000 housing units by the end of this year, 2013, with a further 4,000 houses by the second half of 2014 for the public housing system, including the use of social housing bonds to fund these projects. We're not even asking the government to go as far as your own party's motion back in 2008, which sought the construction of an additional 10,000 social housing units each year for the subsequent 3 years. The sad fact is that this government is continuing with the housing policy of its predecessors, and that is sadly the case. A different era clearly requires a new policy, but it is not forthcoming from this government. And I'll add the words "so far," because I don't deny or doubt your sincerity in wanting to see this addressed. So I'll add the words "so far," and I genuinely hope that the situation will change. A new drive for social housing is essential. Equally essential are comprehensive measures to address mortgage distress. No one in this Dáil who genuinely represents ordinary people can be blind to the reality of mortgage distress in this state. Masses of people have been left with the toxic legacy of the inflated property bubble, and this government has taken minimal action to alleviate the problem. On the contrary, it proposes heaping debt upon debt with its inequitable family home tax. Call it whatever you like. I strongly urge the government to undertake the measures outlined in the Sinn Féin motion, including the removing of the veto given to lenders over proposed insolvency agreements in the Personal Insolvency Act 2012, prioritising the maintenance of the family home and any agreements dealing with residential mortgages, providing in the legislation for the independent adjudication and enforcement on mortgage distress cases, including the possibility of write-downs on portions of the mortgage debt, as well as other options such as debt for equity swaps, mortgage to rent and short selling in the options available when reaching mortgage restructuring agreements, and taking more direct action with the central bank to force lending institutions to adopt more proactive and lender-friendly approach to the mortgage crisis. And I don't care who pulls their hair out, I'm past that point myself. So I'll conclude with this, Cathaoirleach. The taxpayers of this state are bailing out banks and bondholders to the tune of billions. And what return are we getting? As far as hard-pressed mortgage holders are concerned, the answer is sadly zilch. So it is time, and long past time, that this government acted like a government and acted for the people and called the banks to account now, as I genuinely believe you must recognise and feel should be done.
Thank you, Deputy. A call now, finally, on Deputy Des Ellis. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 2 to go.
Firstly, I would like to thank all the deputies of all the parties in this House and the main parties and the independents who have contributed tonight and yesterday to this important debate. I'm glad that while we have had our disagreements, it has mostly been a cordial discussion on these most serious issues. Although the government has put forward a counter motion, which I believe is disappointing, but I believe the discussion has highlighted the seriousness of the problem. Minister, I don't think it's good enough to say we inherited this problem from the previous regime, but to continue with the same tactics and the same approach as the last government is very, very disappointing. Ironically, today it was reported that AIB is to increase its variable interest rates that will affect 70,000 households. If proof was needed that the banks are immune to the difficulty faced daily by struggling mortgage holders, then this is it. This move by AIB should be a call to action by this government to allow an independent body to impose settlements on the banks. Action has been promised again and again, but the figure shows these promises have not been lived up to. Sinn Féin has repeatedly showed there is an alternative. We are nearly tired of reminding the government that there are alternatives, and we have worked hard to present them to this government, give them options we felt they could support. But these proposals have fallen on deaf ears. Last night and tonight, we make that plea again for government benches to listen, to work with us, to put its focus on finally beginning to resolve these outstanding issues which worry the people of this state every day. Equivocation by the government and its failure to take decisive action has unfortunately added to this crisis. Action is required. The first step now must be to revisit the Personal Insolvency Act and remove the final say from the lenders. As long as the lenders have a veto, there is little reason for them to seek fair compromises. We are calling for independent agreements on mortgage distress to be decided by a mortgage restructuring panel appointed by the Minister. This panel would be empowered to act as an arbitrator with the authorisation to impose on both parties agreements aimed at prioritising the protection of the family home. We of course accept that Fine Gael and Labour, or certainly this government, did not create the serious problems we face, particularly in the case of social housing shortage. But it falls on them now to address the problem. The crisis was a collaboration of most governments since the early 80s, who sought in the best traditions of Thatcher to push private ownerships over public provision, not in the interest of improving the conditions of housing for working people, but in order to remove the state's responsibility for housing. Where we differ from the main parties, Sinn Féin believes that housing is a right. In fact, the Labour Party just 5 years ago co-signed a motion in this House, along with Sinn Féin, which called for the construction of 10,000 social housing units a year for the following 3 years. This was against the backdrop of falling revenue and a housing crisis, which was moderate by comparison to the one we face today, with 60,000 on waiting lists rather than 100,000 today. The Labour Party had not then given up on large-scale social housing projects, but of course they had not yet been shackled and dragged to the right by Fine Gael. It is hard to believe we are dealing with the same party. Last night, Joe Costello told us that the government was on target to deliver numbers similar to that called for in this motion. That is not correct. The numbers may be similar, but what they represent is completely different. Joe Costello's numbers represent more stopgap measures, but no solutions. Our motion calls for the commencement of a building programme to deliver 9,000 homes within roughly 2 years. These are not new social housing leasing opportunities, which will be private profit at public expense and revert back into the hands of developers. These are not voluntary bodies renting or buying properties taken on credit. They cannot be sure they can afford, or shared ownership homes which are surrendered, or new rent supplements recipients, or people on FOS, on ROS. This is a proposal to build real houses, real social housing for people. You know, Minister, I think this discussion has been a very worthwhile discussion. We've heard a lot of ideas. We put forward our own ideas on how to look at the whole housing issue. So I'm hoping you will take on board. We also have a homeless crisis. In this, we have mentioned in this about the homelessness and the problem in dealing with the homelessness. We have a real crisis in our hands with mortgage distress and housing. Please try and address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Ellis. And that concludes the debate. So I'm putting the question on amendment number 1 in the name of the Minister for Finance, that the amendment be made. Gunnain Topher an Lasso. Na teachtaí atá ar thaobh na cheiste Aberdís tá. Na teachtaí atá ina cine Aberdís níl. Sílim go bhfuil an ceist rite.
members please take their seats? Marshal Dalla, the vote is taking place shortly. Could we have order, please? Item 104, motion remortgaging restructuring. Amendment number 1 in the name of the Minister for Finance. The question is that the amendment be made. On that question, a division has been challenged. Tellers Thaw Deputies Paul Keogh and Emmett Stagg. Tellers Neil Deputies Angus O'Snuddy and Desi Ellis. Thaw 76, Neil 46. Question is carried. I must now put the question on the motion as amended. Question is that the motion as amended be agreed to. Na Chakti Haven Kesh Abrigis Thaw, Chakti Nagunya Abrigis Neil, Sheil Gorin Kesh Richa. Vote on. Motion remortgage reconstructing. The question is that the motion as amended be agreed to. On that question, a division has been challenged. Tellers Thal Deputies Paul Keogh, Emmett Stagg. Tellers Neil Deputies Angus O'Snuddy and Desi Ellis. Pa 77, Neil 47. Question is carried. If we could have some order, please. We're proceeding now with the finance bill. And Deputy Joe Higgins is in possession. I think the Deputy has 4 minutes. Remain. Deputy Higgins.
Gormagat a chairlig agus modulation bille argedish gavile is a chidiog. Nielen so ak danganu is undine, maar policy realtish. On policy hierne ha party in Lockdebre agus Finnegaele kort kunkin le gavlian a noosinish. Agus policy ata tubistuk o to sak gudere. Nís mó ciirithe agus nís mó ordathe cánach gná daoine gná Lochdebre agus é sinna choristeach go tubisteach cuasaíach nóíochta na tíre. Agus tá bhrí sin cíimiid ráta díostíochta 4.7 faoin gcéad 8,000 daoine óga smó go raibh ortha imeacht ón tír an bliain seochaite I Imirce, mar nach na postan an sá. Inistíocht briste in Oireachtas, gan inistíocht a choristeach I gúrsaí ach na muochta agus cirtha inistíocht poblí. I gnám géana tá an Oireachtas ag tuairteach cáin nua a gléonn siad an cáin mhíne áitiúil, ach an Oireachtas cáin tithe gnádaíine tithe Lochdebre. An mís a chuain, nuair a sroisig 2 milliún litir tailig mór héimpel na tíre seo, beg rac ó bunbar na tíre mar leis an cáin áitiúil seo. Mar tiigh an gnádaíine den céadúir in Oireachtas có trom cúiseach is atá an cáin seo. Suas le €400 nó €200 an ag na bliana, de gná Lochdebre a háfí bhrú hana féin mar I lena a muséidí baile agus le héad. Agus nóair a sroisig na litreacha seo na tithe, is féidir leis an Oireachtas bheith olaf de rac, mór héimpel na tíre, beg clamper agus beg farag agus gubh haar bar daoine. Agus is féidir leis an Oireachtas bheith ag fanacht le feachtas olmhór bán náisiúnta I meas gnádaíine in aig an cháin nó seo, mar go dtuigeann siad. Go bhfuil sé sin trom cúiseach go leor faoi mar atá, ach go raibh sé an áde gach bliain, agus chuir leis sin an cáin ar uisce, agus be mid laut faoi €1,000,000 in ag na bliana, de gach chlán og de gach teilech tar éis chúpla blian. Da bhrí sin, bíg feitheamh le feachtas cócht gnádaíine, bíg feitheamh le baicart náisiúnta ar an cháin seo, bí ag fanacht le daoine ar na stráideanna, le daoine ag corna aig in scach slí gur féidir agus chur brua olmhór ar na páirtithe atá in san Oireachtas. Agus é sin go léir tiltte ag an Oireachtas. Is tubisteach an rud é dulchan cín leis an cáin áirithe seo, agus ceart go daring gách an Oireachtas siar. Ar deireadh hir hawl, sé há tastáil ón tír seo, tá an córas seo capitlacha an córas marga algidish briste ó hús go deireadh nach féidir le riachtaní sí míntir na hórpa, go nádíine na hórpa iad súd a chólíanna. Da bhrí sin polisathe radicacha mar le algidish, le cuasaíach na méachta, polisathe sosialacha tastáil, go meach na bint agus na hinstitúí algidish I nónéireach poblí, faoi stúrú den láach na daoine, I dros go medíis an son I gobir bhatha le trámlach na daoine, ní bhatha leis an mionlach beag na bic móra agus brabús an mionlaigh úd.
Comagad now call Deputy Bernard Durkin. 20 minutes.
Can Corla. Very glad to have an opportunity to speak on this particularly important piece of legislation, of course, which gives legal effect to the budget. I think that we have to retrace our steps for a few moments to consider recent history before we really come to conclusions as to what is the best medicine at the present time. But a famous event in the history of this country once was described as the birth of a terrible beauty. And yes, in fact, in October 2010, another terrible beauty was born. It was the realization of the magnitude of the debt that had fallen on the shoulders and the backs of the people of this country. It was an appallingly difficult situation. It was appalling for the outgoing government at that particular time. Now, they're not entirely blameless, of course, as we know, and I don't blame them entirely for it because the people voted for a succession of Fianna Fáil governments, and that's what happened. And whether it was right or wrong, the people are always right, so we have to accept their decision. But the consequences of what we are now facing, I think we have to study it to fully realise the difficulties that the Irish people